The papers were between the coffee mug and the fruit bowl, positioned so precisely that I knew they hadn't been placed there by accident. I'm Thomas. I'm 38 years old. I'm a civil engineer. And on a Tuesday morning in April, I sat down at my own kitchen table and found out that my marriage was over. Not ending. Over. Already decided, already filed, already signed by an attorney whose name I didn't recognize. A man named Derek Hale, whose office address was listed at the top of the first page in clean serif font. Vanessa was standing at the counter with her back to me, pouring coffee. "I think we've been heading here for a while," she said, without turning around. "I didn't want to make it a scene." I looked at the papers. I looked at her back. I looked at the fruit bowl, the ceramic one we'd bought together at a market in Savannah on our 5th anniversary, painted with small blue flowers. She turned around then. Her expression was composed in the specific way of someone who has rehearsed a moment many times and is now simply executing it. Not cold. Not cruel. Just finished. I had 2 children asleep upstairs. Lily was 8. Owen had just turned 6. I picked up the papers and read the first page. What I found there, buried in the standard legal language of the petition, was a line I had to read 3 times before I understood what it was asking for. Vanessa was not requesting shared custody. She was requesting sole physical and legal custody of both children, with supervised visitation for me on the grounds of what the document described as concerns regarding the home environment. I set the papers down. "What concerns?" I said. She took a sip of her coffee. "Thomas," she said quietly, "let's not do this now. The kids are upstairs." Something shifted in my chest in that moment. Not grief, not yet, but the specific sensation of a floor dropping away beneath a room you thought was solid. I had walked into that kitchen 60 seconds earlier as a husband and father in an imperfect but functioning life. I was leaving it as something else entirely, a man with a document in his hand, and a fight I hadn't known was coming. I didn't know yet how deep the fight would go. I didn't know yet what it would uncover. But something in the way she looked at me, steady, prepared, almost rehearsed, told me that whatever was coming, she had been ready for it far longer than I had. To understand how that Tuesday morning arrived, you have to understand what the 9 years before it looked like from the inside. Vanessa and I met in 2014 through a work connection. She was doing contract marketing for a firm that had hired my engineering company as a consultant on a civic project. She was sharp and funny, and had the particular kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly what impression she's making. I was 30, recently relocated to Harlow Creek from Atlanta, still assembling the basic furniture of my adult life. She made everything feel less provisional. That was the version of her I fell in love with, the one who made uncertainty feel manageable. We married in June 2015. Lily arrived 18 months later. Owen came 2 years after that. For the first 5 or 6 years, the marriage was genuinely solid, not without friction, but the kind of friction that comes from 2 busy people trying to build something real rather than from any fundamental misalignment. We had a house. We had children who were healthy and loud and full of opinions. We had a life that, from the outside, looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. My flaw in that life was a specific kind of accommodation that I had always mistaken for generosity. I deferred. Constantly, habitually, without being fully conscious of the pattern. When Vanessa had a strong opinion about the house, the kids' schools, the family finances, I defaulted to agreement because conflict felt like a threat to the structure rather than a tool for improving it. I told myself this was partnership. It was closer to abdication. And the slow consequence of that abdication was that Vanessa had, over 9 years, made every significant decision in our household, while I had focused on the work that funded those decisions and called that contribution enough. The first sign I registered without processing arrived about 2 years before the divorce papers. Vanessa had taken on a new client, a property development company, significant account. She was excited about it. She began working late regularly, sometimes not home until after the kids were in bed. I handled bath time, stories, the particular negotiation of getting Owen to eat anything that wasn't beige. I didn't resent it. I thought I was being supportive. What I noticed, and left unexamined, was the quality of her distraction when she was home. Not tiredness. Something more specific. A kind of mental presence elsewhere, a preoccupation that manifested in small ways, forgetting things I told her, half-following conversations, the way she'd look at her phone during dinner with an expression I couldn't read. I told myself it was the new client. It was a big account. She was under pressure. Looking back now, that was the first real moment I chose the easier interpretation. Not because the harder one wasn't available to me, it was, but because examining it would have required me to question something I depended on. And I had spent 9 years not questioning things I depended on. My sister Sandra came to visit that autumn. She stayed for a long weekend, and on the last evening, after the kids were asleep and Vanessa had gone to bed early citing a headache, Sandra and I sat on the back porch with a bottle of wine, and she said something I stored carefully and didn't open again for a long time. "She seems like she's planning something," Sandra said. "She's got a big client," I said. Sandra looked at me with the particular patience of an older sister who has decided not to push. "Sure," she said. "Maybe that's it." I didn't ask her what she meant. That was the choice, and it was mine, and I made it deliberately. What I understand now is that the most dangerous form of denial isn't the kind where you believe the lie. It's the kind where you suspect the truth and consciously decide to invest in the lie anyway, because the truth would cost more than you're prepared to pay at that particular moment. I had been making that investment for 2 years. After I read the divorce papers that Tuesday morning, I did the one thing that felt manageable. I went to work. I know how that sounds. My wife had just handed me papers requesting sole custody of my children on unspecified grounds, and I drove to the office, sat at my desk, and looked at structural load calculations for 4 hours. But that was the specific shape of my coping. I had always processed large things slowly, at a distance, while doing something concrete with my hands or my mind. I needed the familiar architecture of work before I could face the unfamiliar architecture of what had just happened. I called Sandra from the parking lot at noon. She listened without interrupting while I described the morning. When I finished, she said, "Derek Hale. You know him?" "I know of him," she said. "He's a family law attorney. Very good reputation. Very expensive." She paused. "Thomas, you don't hire Derek Hale reactively. You hire him when you've been planning something for a while." I sat with that. "How long do you think she's been planning this?" I asked. "I don't know," Sandra said. "But I'd start asking questions I haven't been asking." That evening, after the kids were in bed, Vanessa had moved into the guest room without discussion, a transition so smooth it suggested it had been anticipated. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and began, methodically, to reconstruct the previous 2 years. Bank statements first. We had a joint account for household expenses and individual accounts for personal spending, an arrangement Vanessa had suggested early in the marriage, and which I'd accepted without curiosity. When I looked at the joint account records across the previous 18 months, the pattern was unremarkable. But when I requested my own account summary and looked at the household expense ratios over time, I noticed something that hadn't been visible to me in real time. My contributions had increased steadily, while the joint account balance remained flat. Money was moving somewhere I wasn't watching. Not large amounts. Nothing dramatic. Consistent small transfers to a savings account I knew existed but hadn't examined. An account Vanessa had described, years ago, as an emergency fund. I had not considered that the emergency she was preparing for might be me. The second thing I found was less concrete but more disturbing. I went through the previous 6 months of our shared calendar. We used a family scheduling app, color-coded, theoretically transparent. I began cross-referencing Vanessa's entries against things I actually remembered. The alignment was imperfect. There were blocks marked client meeting or office on days when I had a vague recollection of something that didn't match. A Tuesday she'd come home with the specific energy of someone returning from a social occasion rather than a professional one. A Thursday marked as gym when she'd come back without the particular tiredness of someone who'd exercised. None of this was proof of anything except that I had not been paying attention. That was its own revelation. I had been so thoroughly accustomed to accepting her account of her own movements that I had no independent record of anything. Something tightened in my thinking then, a new precision, uncomfortable and necessary. I had been, for 9 years, a man who trusted by default and verified by nothing. That had felt like virtue. It had functioned as vulnerability. I called a family law attorney of my own the following morning. Her name was Patricia, and she had been recommended by a colleague who'd been through a difficult divorce 3 years earlier. When I described the custody petition and the concerns regarding the home environment language, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's a serious filing. It's also frequently a tactical one. The question is what she's using it to achieve." "What do you mean?" "Sole custody filings with vague grounds are sometimes genuine," Patricia said, "and sometimes they're leverage. Filed early, before the other party has organized themselves to establish a negotiating position." She paused. "Has anything happened in your home recently that could be characterized as a concern? Anything she might have documented?" I thought about that carefully. Lily had fallen off her bike in the driveway 2 months ago and needed 3 stitches. I had been supervising, had taken her to urgent care, had done everything correctly. Owen had had a fever last winter that I'd managed for 2 days while Vanessa was traveling. Standard parenting incidents, both of them. "Nothing I can think of," I said. "Think harder," Patricia said, not unkindly. "Because she and Derek Hale have been building something, and we need to know what it is before we walk into a courtroom." The next 6 weeks were the most methodical period of my life. I am, by training and temperament, someone who works from evidence. I build structures that have to hold weight in the real world. There is no room in that discipline for wishful thinking or incomplete data. I applied that same discipline to the question of my marriage and my children, and what I found was a picture that assembled itself piece by piece into something I had not anticipated. Patricia had suggested a mediator-recommended investigator, not for surveillance, she was careful to clarify, but for financial documentation and background on Derek Hale's previous case patterns. I hired him. His name was Frank, and he was quiet and efficient and delivered his findings in a plain folder without editorializing. Derek Hale's previous cases showed a consistent pattern. He specialized in high-conflict custody disputes initiated by one party who had been a client, in some capacity, for significantly longer than the opposing party realized. He had a reputation for preparation. His clients came to him early, sometimes a year or more before any formal filing, and built their cases patiently. Vanessa had first contacted his office 14 months before she handed me those papers. I sat with that number for a long time. 14 months. Lily had been 6, Owen 4. I had been coaching Owen's Saturday soccer team and renovating the upstairs bathroom and thinking, in the general undifferentiated way of a person who isn't looking for anything, that my marriage was difficult but durable. She had been meeting with a custody attorney. The financial picture that emerged was similarly patient. The emergency fund had grown to a figure that represented approximately 8 months of her living expenses, not joint expenses, hers specifically. She had been calculating. She had been building an exit architecture with the same quiet deliberateness that I applied to structural load planning, and she had done it entirely within the geography of our shared life, invisible because I had never thought to look. Then Frank found something else. He had been reviewing property records, relevant because Vanessa had recently, as part of the divorce filing, listed her anticipated housing costs in documentation that referenced a specific rental property. The address was a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Harlow Creek. Frank pulled the lease. It had been signed 11 months ago. The co-signer was Derek Hale. I read that line 3 times, the same way I'd read the custody petition on that Tuesday morning. Then I called Patricia. "Her attorney co-signed her apartment lease," I said. A long pause. "That's an ethical violation," Patricia said. "That's also a significant personal relationship being disclosed by a document neither of them intended me to see." Another pause. "Thomas, I need you to understand what this means for the case. It means the attorney she hired to pursue sole custody of your children has a personal stake in the outcome of this divorce." The picture shifted completely in that moment. The custody filing, the concerns regarding the home environment, the aggressive positioning, the early filing designed to put me on the back foot, hadn't been purely strategic legal maneuvering. It had been, at least in part, the instrument of a relationship. Vanessa had not simply decided to leave her marriage. She had been building toward a specific destination, with a specific person, for over a year. The custody battle was the mechanism that cleared the path. I drove home that evening and looked at my children eating dinner, Lily explaining something about her school project with the focused energy she brought to everything, Owen pushing peas to the edge of his plate with systematic determination, and felt something settle in me with a weight that had nothing dramatic in it. Just clarity. The particular, cold clarity of a man who finally has the complete load calculation in front of him and understands exactly what the structure can and cannot hold. Looking back, the red flags had been there in a form I could have read. Vanessa's new precision about the emergency fund whenever I mentioned it casually. The way she'd redirected conversations about our long-term plans, where we might live in 10 years, whether we'd ever move closer to Sandra, with a fluency that I'd read as disinterest and should have read as irrelevance. She wasn't disinterested in the future. She had a different one planned. I had been the last person in my own life to know. The mediation session was scheduled for a Thursday morning in a neutral conference room in downtown Harlow Creek. Patricia had requested it after filing our response to the custody petition, a response that, for the first time, introduced the question of Derek Hale's conflict of interest. Vanessa arrived with Hale. I arrived with Patricia. We sat across a long table with a mediator between us, and the room had the particular climate-controlled stillness of a space designed to contain difficult things. Hale opened by outlining Vanessa's position. She was seeking sole custody in the best interests of the children, citing an unstable home environment, and was prepared to allow reasonable visitation. His tone was measured and professional, the tone of a man who had given this speech many times. Patricia let him finish. Then she placed 3 documents on the table. The first was the lease agreement, with Derek Hale's name as co-signer. The second was a timeline of Vanessa's communications with his office, beginning 14 months before the filing, obtained through a formal discovery request that Hale had apparently not anticipated. The third was a financial summary showing the emergency fund's systematic growth over 20 months, cross-referenced against the dates of those communications. The room was very quiet. Hale's composure didn't break. He was too experienced for that, but it shifted. A tightening around the jaw. A very brief, involuntary glance at Vanessa. Vanessa looked at the documents. Then she looked at me. I hadn't planned anything to say. I had imagined this moment in various forms over the preceding weeks, and in most of those imaginings I'd had speeches prepared, about the children, about the 14 months, about the apartment on the east side of town. Sitting across from her, I found that none of the speeches were necessary or interesting. She knew what she'd done. I knew what she'd done. The documents knew what she'd done. The conflict of interest alone is grounds for Hale's disqualification, Patricia said to the mediator. We're also prepared to file a bar complaint. What we're not prepared to do is negotiate custody terms under the conditions your client created. Vanessa's attorney, because he was still technically her attorney, said something quietly to her that I couldn't hear. She looked at her hands. The home environment language, I said. I hadn't planned to speak, but the words came without effort, level and direct. What were you going to say about the home environment, Vanessa? She didn't answer immediately. What were you going to tell a judge about me and the kids? I wasn't going to lie, she said finally. Her voice was quieter than I'd expected. I was going to argue that the instability of the transition period made a single primary residence better for them. Whose instability? She looked at me. Mine, she said. My instability. I was going to argue that the smoother the transition, the better for them. She paused. I wasn't trying to take them from you. I was trying to establish a structure before the chaos started. You created the chaos, I said. She didn't argue that. What happened next was not dramatic. Hale withdrew from the case by the following week, citing a scheduling conflict. The bar complaint Patricia had referenced made the withdrawal essentially involuntary. Vanessa retained new counsel. The custody filing was restructured into a standard joint custody petition. The concerns regarding the home environment language disappeared entirely, which told me everything I needed to know about how genuine it had ever been. The conversation I had needed to have with Vanessa, the real one, about the 14 months and the apartment and the architecture of the exit she'd been building while I was coaching soccer and renovating bathrooms, happened 2 weeks later in the mediator's office with both attorneys present and no audience. She said she had stopped believing in the marriage long before she'd started planning to leave it. She said she'd been afraid to say so directly because she hadn't known how to leave without a structure in place, and building the structure had taken time. She said she hadn't meant for it to become what it became. I believed that. I also understood that believing it changed nothing structural about what had happened. The kids, I said. Whatever this is between us, the kids don't carry it. Agreed, she said. Immediately, without qualification. That, at least, was honest. The divorce was finalized in November, 7 months after the Tuesday morning with the fruit bowl and the papers and the back that had been turned to me. We settled on joint custody, week on, week off, with holidays divided according to a schedule that Lily had opinions about and Owen accepted with the philosophical flexibility of a 6-year-old who mainly cared about continuity of his Saturday soccer routine. I kept the house. Vanessa moved into the east side apartment, which now had only her name on the lease. Whatever had existed between her and Derek Hale had apparently not survived the professional and legal fallout of the discovery documents. I didn't feel satisfaction about that. It wasn't a victory I'd been seeking. The first Sunday I had the kids on my own, genuinely on my own, without the shared household to absorb the day's structure. I made pancakes and let Owen put too many chocolate chips in his, and sat at the kitchen table watching both of them and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not happiness, exactly. Something quieter and more durable. The sense of a life that was now accurately described. What I had, I actually had. What I was, I actually was. There was nothing behind the surface that I didn't know about. That was new. I hadn't realized, until it was present, how long it had been absent. Sandra came for Thanksgiving. She helped me cook and watched me with the kids and didn't say much until the evening, when Lily and Owen were asleep and we were finishing the dishes. You seem different, she said. I probably am. Better different or just different? I thought about it. More accurate, I said. She laughed softly. That's still a very engineer way to put things. Lily asked me once, a few months after the divorce, whether I was sad. She asked it directly, the way 8-year-olds ask things. No preamble, no softening, just the question placed in front of you and waiting. I told her that I had been sad, and that sad wasn't permanent, and that some things that felt bad at first turned out to make room for better things. She considered that for a moment and then said, like when Owen stopped sleeping in my room because I said his feet smelled, and at first it was sad, but then I had more space. I told her that was exactly right. She seemed satisfied. I think about the man who sat down at that breakfast table in April sometimes. He thought he was in an imperfect but honest marriage. He thought his wife's legal preparations and financial planning and carefully cultivated exit were things he'd have known about if they existed. He had built his sense of safety on the assumption that what he couldn't see wasn't there. He was wrong. And being wrong about something that fundamental, for that long, does something to the way you understand yourself. Not catastrophically. Not permanently. But genuinely. I learned to ask questions I had previously decided were impolite. I learned that accommodation without limit isn't generosity. It's a vacancy that other people's plans move into. I learned that the children sitting across from me at a pancake breakfast were not protected by my willingness to keep the peace. They were protected by my willingness to see clearly and act accordingly. That's what I took out of the wreckage. Not bitterness. Bitterness is expensive, and the return is poor. Just a more accurate blueprint. It turned out to be enough to build on. The story of Thomas and Vanessa is, at its surface, a story about divorce. Beneath that surface, it's a story about two people who had, over 9 years, gradually inhabited completely different versions of the same marriage, and the catastrophic moment when those versions were forced into the same room. Vanessa's behavior throughout the narrative is psychologically consistent with a specific pattern. Someone who experiences commitment as a form of vulnerability rather than security, and who responds to that experience not by addressing it openly but by maintaining a private counterstructure, an emergency exit, always quietly under construction. Her 14 months of preparation were not, as she eventually acknowledged, driven by cruelty or contempt. They were driven by fear. The fear of financial dependence, of being caught without options, of a future that had been built on someone else's income and someone else's reliability. That fear is real and comprehensible. What it produced, a custody filing weaponized as leverage, an attorney who crossed professional and personal lines, a year of systematic deception, was a response disproportionate to the actual threat. Because Thomas was not, in any meaningful sense, a danger to his children or to Vanessa's future. He was accommodating to a fault, professionally stable, and fundamentally decent. The architecture of Vanessa's exit plan was built to defeat an adversary that didn't quite exist. She had constructed a legal and financial fortress against a man who had spent 9 years choosing not to fight. The irony is that her preparations, specifically the Hale relationship and the lease, became the very thing that undid her tactical advantage. What the story reveals about Thomas is more nuanced than simple victimhood. His excessive accommodation was not weakness in the ordinary sense. It was a philosophy of relationship that had been, for years, mutually beneficial. It kept the household smooth. It protected his sense of himself as a reasonable and non-confrontational person, and it transferred the burden of decision-making to someone who appeared to want it. What he failed to account for was the way that transfer of agency, sustained over nearly a decade, had produced a power asymmetry so complete that Vanessa could plan a major legal offensive against him for over a year without his awareness. He had not simply trusted her. He had systematically removed himself from the information flow of his own life. The custody battle functions in this story as more than a legal dispute. It is the mechanism by which Thomas was forced, suddenly, without preparation, to do the one thing he had spent 9 years avoiding, engage directly with a conflict he could not defer, accommodate, or smooth over. He had to look at the structure of his marriage clearly and completely, perhaps for the first time. What he found there was not only his wife's deception, but his own long collaboration with his own ignorance. That is the harder discovery, and it is the one that ultimately produces something useful in him. The twist the story delivers, that the custody battle was not purely adversarial legal strategy, but the instrument of a personal relationship between Vanessa and her attorney, reframes the entire narrative. It suggests that Vanessa's departure from the marriage had not been a gradual dissolution, but a deliberate pivot towards something already chosen. Thomas had not been losing his wife slowly. He had been living beside someone who had already, in every meaningful way, left, and who was completing the administrative process of formalizing a decision made long before. That reframing does something important. It relocates Thomas's responsibility. He was not the cause of the marriage's failure. He was the person who made the failure invisible by refusing to look at it. These are related but distinct failures, and understanding the distinction is the beginning of something better. What stays with me about this story is the image of those divorce papers between the coffee mug and the fruit bowl. Placed there carefully. Centered. Ready. The amount of preparation that went into that single moment, 14 months of legal consultation, financial planning, an apartment already signed, and Thomas had no idea. None. That's what strikes me as the most quietly devastating part. Not the betrayal itself, the patience of it. And I think it raises a question worth sitting with. How well do we actually know the interior life of the person we share a home with? Not their habits or their preferences or the surface of their days, but what they're planning, what they're afraid of, what they've decided that they haven't told you yet. Sometimes the most dangerous distance in a relationship isn't the obvious kind. It's the kind that looks, from the outside, exactly like ordinary life.